Guten Tag, everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of History with a Drywaller. Today, I'm starting my series on the Soviet Union, and I found that the most effective place to start, I think, will be an overview of Karl Marx. I won't get much into Marx's biography today, but I'd like to give a brief overview of his biography and maybe a little bit of insight into what he advocated, what he believed, and what his successors and his followers were trying to implement. Now, before we begin, I would like to add a little disclaimer. I am not myself a Marxist, and in fact, I am not very favorably disposed towards Karl Marx or his ideas. I, in my teenage years, was a democratic socialist, and a quite committed one at that, and I am also, as you may have seen from my last episode, very favorably disposed towards the modern Finnish and wider Nordic welfare states. So I'm by no means hostile to left-wing politics or ideas. However, Marx in particular has always rubbed me the wrong way. So I would like to make that very clear that this podcast, being sort of an informal or an attempt at informality by myself, is likely going to show a bit or quite a lot of my bias against Karl Marx. But now that we have that out of the way, let's begin. To start with the simple bit first, Karl Heinrich Marx was born in 1818 and he died in 1883. He was a notoriously difficult man to get along with. He was an outcast from many communist groups throughout his life. He once reacted with surprise and irritation upon learning that there were people who called themselves Marxists. His contention was that he could be the only Marxist, as only he truly understood the nature of the human condition. Yeah, that's the kind of guy that we're dealing with here. He also did not take part in any of the fighting during the revolutions of 1848. I haven't heard a very convincing explanation as to why, but one of them that was put forward is that he viewed his expertise and his opinions as being far too valuable to risk in the fires of revolution. So, yeah, kind of a disappointing start to such a famous revolutionary career. Now, as for his ideas, Marx himself hated philosophy. He viewed philosophy as inane, and he often implies it to be quite effeminate and useless. That being said, Marx himself is arguably a philosopher. He saw himself as a social scientist, and he viewed his writings and his ideas as highly empirical and scientific. But as many people who have studied and commented on Marx have pointed out, very few, if any, of his ideas are in any way testable, and those of his ideas that are testable are often predictions that were, put it mildly, emphatically disproved. His most famous prediction is that, and he predicted this in the latter half of the 1800s, he predicted that a great European war was going to break out and that it would lead to the extinction of nationalism and a great socialist revolution. Well, a great European war did break out. It didn't really take a genius to see that that was on the horizon, but it actually led to a huge surging of nationalism and very few and limited successes for socialist movements. But during his lifetime, he viewed himself as nothing less than a scientific and empirical scholar of the human condition. In fact, seeing himself as such a scientist, he dedicated his magnum opus, called Das Kapital, to Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, being Charles Darwin, was very polite in his response to Karl Marx. He congratulated Marx on his book and on his success as an author, but Darwin very noticeably did not endorse Marx's ideas. In fact, several people close to Charles Darwin have alleged that he never even opened the copy of Das Kapital that was sent to him. Darwin is reported to have commented that Marx's ideas were wild and unscientific. So there you go. But I guess that brings us to the question of what are Marx's ideas? Now, Karl Marx has two main publications where people draw most of their conclusions about his ideas, and that is the Communist Manifesto, published in 1848, and Das Kapital, published in 1867. Now, most people are most familiar with the Communist Manifesto, but to my understanding, Das Kapital is a more broad and instructive source for his wider ideas and his theories. So I'm going to be drawing most of my understanding from Das Kapital. And what I am going to be drawing is unfortunately going to have to be quite brief, as Marxism is a very complex and very layered series of ideas. Now, Marx was what is called a materialist, which is he believed in nothing that couldn't be proved empirically and with experimentation and science. So he did not believe in spirituality or in souls or in spirits or in, great prophets or great men. Now, more than one person has commented that he seems to see himself as some sort of great prophet, but evidently this did not count. He also believed in what's called dialectics, which, to painfully oversimplify, is essentially the idea that history is made up of conflicts, and these conflicts are contests between two different ideas. One idea will be known as the thesis, and the other idea will often then be known as the antithesis. And through this conflict, often in Marxism this takes the form of class conflict, you get synthesis, which is usually the next stage in Marx's historical idea. Now, under this structure of dialectical materialism, Marx believed that all human history, at least at the time of his writing, consisted of four main stages. And these stages are, number one, primitive communism. Marx had an idea that before people settled down and made things like farms, all human society was cooperative and egalitarian, and that everyone shared everything and there was no possessions. And this idea is not supported by modern anthropology. To put it mildly, as we discovered in our exploration of Finnish prehistory in episode 1, hunter-gatherer societies can be quite diverse, and trying to put them all into one basket and then make the basket seem sort of like a Disney film does not seem to be in line with a lot of modern anthropology and a lot of studies in this regard. Now, from my understanding, the way this is usually characterized is that Marx read a book on Native Americans, liked it, and decided that all humanity reflected this idea he had in his head of Native American hunter-gatherers. I don't know if that's true. That's just the story that's been passed down over the years. Now, stage 2 for Karl Marx is what he called the slave society. This would be classical Greece, classical Rome, presumably the early Mesopotamian civilizations, the Indus Valley civilizations. He believed that all agrarian societies in this era were fundamentally based on slavery, and that slavery led to the rise of an aristocracy. Now, that aristocracy would take the form of the feudal landlords in Marx's third stage of development, feudalism. Now, many of you are likely familiar with feudalism. Feudalism is actually a fairly controversial term in anthropology, but for our purposes, it should do just fine. Feudalism is basically the idea that landed aristocrats would own just about everything and would have serfs and peasants under their jurisdiction to work the land in a relatively limited and decentralized way. Now, in Marxist understanding, feudalism gave rise to the merchant classes, who eventually overthrew the aristocracy, and that led to the advent of the fourth stage of Marx's concept of history, and that is capitalism. Now, there's a bit of confusion in my mind, because under Marx's theory, the wildly slave-reliant economies of many European empires in this era are still considered capitalist and not slave societies, even though they arguably had a much heavier reliance on slavery than the slave societies that he describes in stage 2. But that could very well be my lack of understanding of his theories. That aside, we get to the fundamental crux of Marxist thinking. Marx, at the time of his writing, which again is the early to mid 1800s, was living in what he characterized as the fourth stage of human development, that being capitalism. Therefore, many of his writings are based on deep, extensive critiques of capitalism. Now, these are the parts of Marx's writing that I think have aged the best. These parts of his writing are usually the most favorably looked upon by not only the general public, but I think most of academia as well. And among these ideas are the simple idea that Marx fundamentally believed that intrinsic to capitalism was economic exploitation, that the very nature of capitalism would lead to people on the, shall we say, the bottom of the social hierarchy, or the socioeconomic hierarchy, being used and exploited by the wealthy and the powerful. And not only that, but in Marx's formulation, he believed that this economic exploitation, combined with the growing industrialization and factory system that we see in so much of Europe and the Americas during the Industrial Revolution, he believed that this would all alienate someone from their very humanity. So when it comes to Marx's ideas on capitalism, those are the two big ideas that you want to keep in your head, is exploitation and then the following alienation of oneself from their humanity and from civility. And this all leads to, in Marx's idea, stage 5, which is communism or socialism. Now, in Marx's writing, he used the words communism and socialism essentially interchangeably. It should be noted that in modern usage, in modern economics, those two words are no longer interchangeable. Communism and socialism are not thought to mean the same thing anymore, although in Marx's writing, he uses them to essentially mean the same thing. Now, what is communism? And we are going to just be calling stage 5 communism from here on out to avoid confusing. Communism is basically when the oppressed and exploited and alienated working class rises up and creates a communal state that in Marx's idea would cover the entire world. There would be no states and no borders. This would make racism obsolete. And to put it simply, everybody would share everything and be happy forever. This was thought by Marx to be the final stage of human development, and he believed that this stage would last for the entire rest of human history. It has to be said, this idea of communism being the final stage where everyone will live happily ever after is quite utopian, seems to me. However, you should be careful when telling Marxists that, because just like Marx hated philosophers, Marx also criticized and deeply disliked what he called utopians. Evidently, he did not view himself as a utopian. Now, as far as how to create this amazing, wonderful communist utopia, to use a word that would likely make Marx very upset, Marx believed that communism was inevitable. There was no concept for him about making communism or enacting communist revolution. And in fact, in his lifetime, he was distinctly inactive several key moments on the revolutionary stage, as we've mentioned before, because he believed that once the revolution came, not only would no one need to start it, but it could not be stopped even if you wanted to. Not only that, but Marx believed that communism was going to come about soon. In fact, in some of his writings, you almost get the sense that he thinks he's going to see this communist state take hold in his very lifetime. One more important thing to mention about this coming communist revolution in Marx's mind is the fact that he believed this revolution would take place in the most industrialized and capitalist nations in the world. Specifically, he believed Germany, France, England, and potentially the United States to be the most likely candidates for launching this world revolution. And before we close, I think now is a good time to address one of the major problems that modern anthropologists and economists and sociologists have with Karl Marx. And you may have noticed it already. Marx was very Eurocentric. He basically thought that Europe housed everything important about human history, and that Europe would be the launching point that would create this beautiful new communist world. In fact, in those rare moments where he even considered other cultures, he quite famously dismissed all of Asian history as being one stage that he called Eastern despotism. Now, of course, anyone who's studied the history of places like China or India or the Middle East knows that there's a lot more going on than just one solid state of Eastern despotism. But Karl Marx disagreed. But with all that having been covered, I think that lays the groundwork quite nicely for our expedition into Soviet history. So, with that, I would like to end our episode for today and begin preparations for Soviet history. I'll see you then.